I'm also aware that as an environmentalist, and I do quite a lot with community groups, I do quite a lot with the media, there are big issues about taking negative messages to people too much of the time. With the media in particular, people, their attention span switches off. The media love a good story, but once the story has run its course, they don't want to know about the deeper issues. And they do find constant negative stories problematic. And I'm also aware that when you talk to communities or to educational groups, there are some stark issues to present, but you have to also give people positives. And one of the great things about nature is that people are passionate about it, people are uplifted by it, people are renewed and refreshed by contact with nature, and they care desperately about it. So these are all positive things that I think we need to try to bring to the table when we are talking to people. So I'm talking tonight about climate change, biodiversity extinction and the rest. Time for despair or time for action. Because one of the problems is that if you are so fraught, and I mean, one of the issues at the moment is that huge numbers of people, particularly young people, are desperately worried and depressed by things like climate change, by things like biodiversity extinction. And they feel absolutely powerless. There was some work a few years ago. I do work on flooding and its impacts, and I do work on the history of flooding over long periods of time. And some work was done after the 2019 floods, which showed that a huge proportion of the community was stressed, really seriously stressed, by the risk and worry of flooding. And this included people who had never been flooded, and where they lived, they would never be flooded, but they were still incredibly stressed by the whole situation. And that is not a good thing. We need to find positive ways to move forwards. So, setting the scene, climate change and extreme weather events. Now, the first thing is, if we're going to talk about climate and climate change, climate crisis, etc., then we need to be clear what it is we're actually talking about. So I thought I'd introduce a few basic ideas. I don't want to get bogged down in the detail, but to give you a flavour of the sort of things that we're dealing with. And the scenarios that we're presented with are different impacts, from a more modest rise of 1.5 degrees centigrade to 2 degrees to 3 degrees. And this makes a big difference to the world, to our way of life, to the future of the planet. So there are different scenarios, and we need to think about what those scenarios imply. There's also the issues that it's not as simple as simply a rise in temperature. There are questions about where in the global system those temperatures are recorded and where they're rising, and the impacts of, for example, melting of the Arctic ice sheets impacting on oceanic heat engines, the Gulf Stream. So with one set of scenarios, Great Britain gets warmer and we move towards a climate which is closer maybe to the present day south of France. And people say, oh, that's not bad. I would, I quite like south of France. I might be quite happy with that. And of course, the reality is very, very different. But also the reality is terribly different if the Gulf Stream is pushed further south, because we lose that heat engine and we're at about the same distance north as Moscow, and we suddenly move into a climate a bit like Moscow. And I remember some years back, I was doing work in Poland and Ukraine, and we went over in winter, and it was when the temperature in Moscow was down to -35. And I remember seeing people in a marketplace in the city with potatoes that they'd bought, and they could throw these on the ground and they just bounced up again. They were frozen solid so hard. They just had no impact. So we need to think about what it is that we are going to experience. Now, this means as well that we need to be fairly clear about what we talk about, how we define climate or weather. So climate is the average weather in a given area over a relatively long period of time. And the way we describe this includes information on average temperature in different seasons and rainfall and sunshine. And we also often include the chance of extreme weather. And some of the meteorological variables that are commonly measured are temperature, humidity, atmospheric pressure, wind, and precipitation. In a broader sense, climate is the state of the components of the climate system, which includes the ocean, the land, and the cover of ice on the earth and on the oceans. So climate change is systematic change in long-term climate variables like temperature, precipitation, pressure, or wind. And it's generally taken as being sustained over several decades or longer, and often considered to be average weather over periods exceeding 30 years. So a couple of very cold winters, a couple of very hot summers is not the issue. It's longer trends that we are dealing with because weather is variable anyway. And climate change can be due to a process called natural external forcing. That's change in things like solar emission, sunlight, or changes in the Earth's orbit. So this is where the Earth is not always at the same position in relation to the sun, and therefore the amount of energy we're receiving coming into the system varies. There are also natural internal processes of the climate system, or there are human-induced changes. And of course, you'll be aware of the often heated, if you pardon the pun, heated debates on the relative importance of humanity's impacts and of the natural fluxes. So causes of climate change. Well, the overwhelming evidence is the main cause of climate change is burning fossil fuels such as oil, gas, and coal. There's very little doubt about that. The burnt fossil fuels release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, and this is carbon that has been captured by photosynthesis in geological times. And this release causes the planet to heat up. So what causes climate change? Well, the Earth's climate has changed over the 4.5 billion or so years that the Earth has been in existence. And until recently, and we can track this back in long-term geological records, things like ice cores and stuff like that, natural factors were the main cause. Natural influences include volcanic eruptions, changes in the Earth's orbit, and shifts in the Earth's crust, what we call plate tectonics. And over millions of years, Earth has experienced a series of ice ages, including cooler periods, glacials, and warmer periods, interglacials. So we have this boom-bust system occurring over long periods of time. And glacial and interglacial periods cycle roughly every 100,000 years, caused by changes in the Earth's orbit around the sun. And for the past few thousand years, Earth has been in an interglacial, i.e. a slightly warm period, with reasonably constant temperature. However, since the Industrial Revolution in the 1700s and 1800s, global temperatures have increased at much faster rates. And by burning fossil fuels and changing land use, and the land use is one which people still don't seem to really understand, and it's not one that politicians want to understand. Burning fossil fuels and carbon is a robust explanation, and the problem is that attributing climate change almost solely to carbon and saying, oh, well, we can trade it, we can bring it into a market system, we can plant trees, we can harvest carbon, etc., is easier than say, well, actually, one of the big problems is the way we manage the land, which on the one hand has released carbon in huge amounts, which I'll talk about later, but also it's compromised the ability of the Earth's ecological systems to mop up carbon. So we've changed land use in ways that are clearly unsustainable, and we are still doing so. And that's far harder for politicians to buy into. However, whichever way we look at it, human activity has become the leading cause of climate change. Scientists have recorded 5 significant ice ages during the Earth's long history. I've listed them there. I'm not going to go through all those, but it just makes a point of these big fluctuations, and then within them, the smaller variations. And you can see here glacial and interglacial cycles over the past 450,000 years. Warmer, colder, warmer, colder, warmer, colder, and little bits in between. One of the things that you will notice from what I said so far is that climate is not static. So when we talk about climate change, it has always changed, but it's the long-term changes and the direction of the changes and the speed of those changes that is now causing the greatest angst. But the idea that climate is stable and should remain stable is, quite frankly, totally naive, because when you look at the history, it hasn't been stable. So greenhouse gases and the greenhouse effect. Again, this is not necessarily how people, well, most people perhaps perceive it. Now, some gases in the Earth's atmosphere trap heat and stop it escaping back into space. It's like the pane of glass in your greenhouse. These are called greenhouse gases. And they act as a warming blanket around the Earth, giving us what we call the greenhouse effect. Now, greenhouse gases come from both human and natural sources, things like carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, etc. They all occur naturally. Ones like carbon dioxide have a longer time period in the cycling through the atmosphere. Methane is relatively quick, so it can increase and then decrease quite quickly. But they provide a warming blanket. They keep us warm. Now, others, such as the chlorofluorocarbons, the CFCs that you'll have heard about, are actually only produced by human activity. So if we see those in the record, they are due to us alone. The others can be produced by natural processes, and they are part of the natural processes. And the way the system works is that when short-wave solar radiation, sunlight, reaches the Earth, most of it passes through to hit the surface of the Earth. It's not absorbed, it's not retained by the atmosphere. The Earth absorbs most of this radiation and then gives it off as longer wave infrared radiation. And this is where the technical bit comes in, because the infrared radiation does not pass through the atmosphere in the same way. Greenhouse gases absorb some of this infrared radiation that's being radiated back out, and instead of passing back into space, the atmosphere then emits radiation in every direction, sending some of it back to the surface and causing the planet to heat up. So the greenhouse effect. However, what people often forget is that we talk about the greenhouse effect as though it's something bad. Well, without the greenhouse effect, we aren't here. We can't survive. The Earth is about 30 degrees colder without the greenhouse effect than it is today. So it's absolutely essential to life. And you can see there radiation coming in, hitting the surface of the Earth, being re-radiated back as infrared radiation, and then some of it radiated from the atmosphere, from the greenhouse gases, some of it back down to Earth, some of it out into space. So that's greenhouse effect. However, the problem is the human impacts. And since the Industrial Revolution, we've added more and more greenhouse gases into the air, trapping ever more heat. Instead of keeping the Earth at a warm, stable temperature, the greenhouse effect now heats the planet much faster. This is what we call the enhanced greenhouse effect, and this is the one that's the problem. It's the main cause of current climate change and the speed of current climate change. And a lot of it is to do with the Industrial Revolution. It's also, I would argue, to do with the Agricultural Revolution, and some of it probably occurs before the big industrialization period. It occurs in the 1500s and 1600s and 1700s. And a lot of it, I've argued, is to do with the massive drainage of wetlands and fenlands across the planet. And that both releases carbon, but it also affects the ability of the ecological systems to mop up excess carbon. Now, again, when we look at an industrial situation like that over a city like Sheffield or Birmingham or Wolverhampton, we see two processes. One is the release of greenhouse gases and warming things up. But the other one, which should not be dismissed lightly, is a thing called the albedo effect. And that's the smoke and grit and grime which blankets large areas and actually reflects sunlight back out into space and can cause cooling. And I remember a documentary back in probably the 1970s, a TV documentary talking about the albedo effect and how pollution was about to trip the Earth back into an ice age because of global cooling. And we even had, where I lived near Meersbrook, a local builder was leafleting houses almost the very next day with a message on the old bander sheets, if any of you remember those bander sheets that you could reproduce leaflets on before modern printing. And the message was, insulate now, scientists forecast ice age. Well, within a few years, nobody was talking about the albedo effect. It was all about the greenhouse effect. So human causes of climate change. Humans cause climate change by releasing carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases into the air. Today, there's more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere than there has ever been in at least the past 2 million years. During the 20th and 21st centuries, the level of carbon dioxide rose by 40%. So carbon dioxide is only there in a small amount, but it's increasing disproportionately. Of course, the coal measures, geologically, the Carboniferous period was very high in carbon dioxide, which is why we got the coal deposited and the enhanced vegetation growth of that particular time. But for our present period, carbon dioxide is rocketing away and it's reaching ever higher levels, and they're having a significant effect. So we produce greenhouse gases in different ways by burning fossil fuels, and that releases stored carbon dioxide into the air. Deforestation globally has been a massive issue, and it's continuing. Forests remove and store carbon dioxide, and cutting them down means carbon builds up quicker because there are no trees to absorb it. And the trees release the carbon they stored when we burn them. But if you are harvesting and burning and harvesting and burning, at least you are mopping up with new tree growth. If it's sustainable forestry, you're mopping up the same as you've burned. So that is more sustainable. When you're burning coal or gas, you're releasing carbon that was locked away millions of years ago. So that's new carbon into the system. Agriculture, planting crops and rearing animals releases many different types of greenhouse gases into the air. A lot of animals that are kept in farming produce methane, which is 30 times more powerful than carbon dioxide. Nitrous oxide used for fertilizers is 10 times worse and nearly 300 times more potent than carbon dioxide. So we need to think about some of these things. However, with agriculture, again, there's a twist, because if you actually have animals such as cattle and they are reared sustainably and organically, then they produce far less methane. The ones that produce the methane are often fed on highly intensive food sources, which really exacerbate the problem. I've talked to farmers and they say, they can produce livestock which produce very little methane. You just have to have a different system and not the intensive sort of system. And the sort of things which present politicians are trying to foist on us from the Americans, for example, where you have intensive factory farmed livestock. And that is desperately bad for things like greenhouse gases. Another source of greenhouse gases, and when we talk about different energy sources, for example, this needs to be taken into account. Because if you are talking about, say, nuclear energy, which I can remember as a young environmentalist, this was the big no-no. And now governments are talking about nuclear as this is the big solution. Well, nuclear energy actually requires a lot of concrete and cement in the infrastructure. And concrete and cement are major contributors to climate change, causing around 2% of the entire carbon dioxide emissions. So what about natural changes in climate? Well, there are many natural causes of climate change. Natural cycles alternating between warming and cooling. These are known as forcings, and they force climate to change. So processes in the natural world actually forcing through changing climate. And this is where a lot of the arguments have been, because some people say, oh, well, it's not human activity, it's natural forcings. Well, they can have a big effect, but they contribute to climate change. But they are not the underlying primary cause of the present situation. The leading cause of current climate change is human activity and the release of greenhouse gases. And this is what all the sensible research actually shows us. Now, in terms of natural forcings, for example, the Earth's orbit around the sun is not even, it's eccentric. So sometimes we're closer, sometimes we're further away. The way the Earth tilts and the way that tilt oscillates is called the precession, and that also affects the amount of energy we're getting from the sun. So these are known as Milankovitch cycles. And if the Earth travels around the sun, its path and its axis tilt, and they change slightly, and these Milankovitch cycles affect sunlight falling on the Earth, causing temperature change. However, these are well documented and they occur over tens or even hundreds of thousands of years and are not causing the climate changes we see today. These are almost the backdrop to that. These are the swings and roundabouts. There are also the things that you'll have heard of, the El Nino, the Southern Oscillation in the Pacific Ocean heat engine. So Pacific Ocean deep water temperatures. And in El Nino years, global temperature warms, and in La Nina years, it cools. These affect global temperature for short periods, months or years, but they don't explain the one-way persistent warming. And if people are still doubtful, then they just have to think back to what this last year has been like. And I think even hardened skeptics about changing climate have woken up to things when housing estates on the edge of London and here in South Yorkshire are burnt down during the drought and intense heat. So I think people are starting reluctantly to accept that these are happening. And natural forces can contribute to climate change. They're not the underlying reasons. So solar irradiance, changing energy from the sun, affects the temperature of the Earth. But recent fluxes are not enough to change climate. Increased solar energy would make the entire atmosphere warmer, but warming is only in the lower layer. In other words, it's what's coming up from below and being held by the greenhouse gases. Another one, and it's easy to see why people think that what we do is insignificant. Another one is volcanic eruptions. So volcanoes can be catastrophic, but they have mixed effects on climate. So eruptions produce aerosol particles that actually cool the Earth. They also release things like carbon dioxide, which warms it. But volcanoes produce 50 times less carbon dioxide than do humans. They're not the leading cause of global warming. They can cause short-term impact, but probably the overall impact of volcanic eruptions, and certainly through geological history, has been cooling periods because of the dust and the particles. And there were huge volcanoes went up in early industrial Europe. Well, not in Europe, but the global volcanoes had an impact on people in Europe and had an impact on people in prehistory as well. And we can document these volcanic eruptions, but what they did was drop temperatures. I think it was the 1700s. It was 2 years in Scotland, the temperature never got above freezing. And across Europe, people starved because the volcanic eruption blanketed the continent and temperatures dropped. So cooling is a dominant impact of volcanic eruptions, not warming. And this is because of the huge amounts of dust. And you can see, you know, these are massive, massive global events, and they can have a huge impact. But overall, it's cooling, not warming. So the scientific consensus is that humans are the leading cause of climate change, i.e. us. And the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has stated unequivocally that human activity is a primary cause of global warming. Natural climate cycles can change the temperature of the Earth, but not at the scale and the speed as witnessed. Many things affect climate change, but there's irrefutable evidence that human activity, burning fossil fuels, and changing land use are the primary cause. So what are the impacts? Well, you may all remember David Bellamy. Now, David died a few years back, and I did know him. And he was an inspirational scientist, environmentalist, botanist. He didn't believe in human-induced climate change. And the reason was that his argument, which is a sensible argument, is that if you increase carbon dioxide and you increase atmospheric temperature, then you should increase the growth of plants, which is both phytoplankton in the oceans and areas like the Amazon rainforest and the African and Indonesian rainforests and our own peat bogs and things like that. But that wasn't happening, because what should happen is that they should mop up the excess. So carbon drops, temperature drops, and things goes back into normal. And it's what we call homeostasis. It remains balanced. Now, David's arguments are very robust. He also showed temperature rising before carbon dioxide levels rose in the 1600s. However, I think the thing to learn from what he said is not that human-induced climate change isn't happening, it's that the system is imbalanced. So you then have to ask the question, why is it imbalanced? And it's because of everything else that we've done to it. So the oceans are no longer capable of mopping up the excess, and the rainforests have largely gone and are still going. So the impacts on nature are profound and getting worse year by year. So we have dysfunctional ecology. We've got breakdown of food chains, food webs, seasonal cycles, and interdependencies. We have a catastrophic increase in pests and diseases. And even our response to this is desperately ill-informed, I think. There's a lot of action being taken at the present time to try and stop diseases spreading in trees through ancient woodlands. And the answer from the Forest Commission appears, well, instructed by DEFRA, and then the Forest Commission dispensed the instructions to everybody else, is to clear fell the trees. So we are busy flattening ancient woodlands, and in the process actually destroying entire medieval and sometimes prehistoric landscapes as well, all in the attempt to control pests and diseases. It is really very, very peculiar. We're affecting the distribution and abundance of animals and plants. We are triggering massive spread of invasive species and on the other hand, extinctions of other species because of climate change. Crops, which we depend on, again, we have a huge educational job to do because a lot of people, particularly kids now, don't understand where their food comes from and the importance of sustainable food production. And crops in many areas are no longer capable of being grown in the climatic envelope or in the geographic space that they have been in the past. We have a huge problem and it's getting worse. But the ecology is dysfunctional. The connection between flowering times and emergence of insects and things that you've heard about, the crisis in pollinating insects. These are all desperate impacts. And then, of course, invasive species. Now, actually, I like the ringneck parakeets. My scientific training is I'm an invasion biologist. And these are really very interesting beasts, but not everybody likes them. They're non-native, but the non-natives are spreading and there will be more of them. We can control them, we can't eradicate them, and there will be more and more because of globalization and because of climate change. To some extent, this has always happened. Iconic species like the brown hare, for example, is not native, came with the Celts and then probably reintroduced by the Normans. Fallow deer were introduced by the Normans. A whole host of other species, pheasants not native. So we have to get used to this situation, but extreme, climate change, globalization, all these things are going to change it completely. Now, extreme weather and its consequences are part of this climate scenario. So increasingly we get floods, but we also get droughts, and flooding and drought are the flip side of the same thing. If you have a flood, the water that should be held from that same amount of rainfall should be held in the ground, should be topping up groundwater, isn't doing so. It's rushing off the land because of the land use change that we've had, because of the drainage that we've had, because of the way we canalised and culverted and straightened rivers and drained floodplains. The water rushes out, floods the land downstream, and then we have a drought because the water's gone. So flood and drought are part of the same situation. And storms are becoming more and more extreme. The way that hurricanes in North America are categorized, they had to add a new level of storm intensity because the old system they had didn't cover for the extreme weather they're getting. I've had friends in Florida who have been experiencing winds of something like 200 kilometers an hour. Just imagine that. And then extreme heat. I think we had a day in Sheffield this last summer that went up to about 40. That is very, very hot. And combined with things like removal of trees, the Sheffield street tree crisis and things like that, if you get a tipping point from 35 degrees to 40 degrees in highly populated urban areas, people die. Vulnerable people die. So this again is a consequence of climate change. And yet in the winter, you may still have extreme cold. Casting mind back to 2010, 11, we had bitterly cold weather from November onwards. So because you get hot summers doesn't mean you're going to get warm winters. We might do, and we have had some, but it doesn't stop the possibility of prolonged bitterly cold periods as well. And along with all these, particularly with extreme weather, we are having problems like soil degradation and erosion. And a lot of this is down to modern farming systems. And if you actually look online at images of Great Britain, satellite images, you will see pouring out of every great estuary, the Thames, the Humber, the Mersey, the Severn, great shadows of dark material in the water. And that is sediment. That is your topsoil that is washing away and eroding and then polluting the ocean, polluting the seas so destroying the fisheries as well. And suddenly lands that have been flood-free for maybe 200 years are underwater. And of course, lots of our urban areas and our industrial areas have been built on what was former floodplain, and therefore are incredibly vulnerable to flooding now. And they are a contributing factor. If you build on the floodplain, you are speeding the flow of water downstream, and you are ultimately going to get very wet indeed. And all these changes bring about appalling social and humanitarian problems. And these are likely to increase social and economic imbalance and associated unrest that we already have. We're seeing globally significant displacement of communities. You've only got to look at the unrest in Africa and the migrant communities leaving Africa desperate to find some way out of the situation and their predicament. And there are massive economic implications of all this, and human welfare and disease and all sorts of things. It is a dreadful situation. And most of this is coming about through climate change, and most of the climate change is coming about through the actions of the industrial world. So what are the issues for economic and development situation? Well, they're huge and unpredictable, from extreme weather impacts to food supply, water supply, disease, displacement, damage to infrastructure, health costs, etc. There are opportunities too. Some of the changes may trigger opportunities, but they, in the short term, trigger huge need, a need for adaptation and for mitigation of what climate is doing. And there are opportunities to adapt and to do this. I put this in as a Sheffield United fan. This is the Wednesday football ground being used as what I would describe as off-channel flood storage, but moving swiftly on. But there are things that we can do. And I find it very strange that we don't do this more seriously. This is a solar farm. I don't like solar farms, particularly in farmland. And we need to have cleverer ways that we can actually use farmland to harness maybe sunlight, but also to still be farmland. However, why are we not putting solar panels? And I have talked to firms who are very interested. Why are we not putting solar panels on every industrial or distribution unit along all the motorways and other areas? I'm doing work with Doncaster Council on a future landscape plan. And all the way along the M18, there are huge distribution centres like Amazon and others. And they haven't got a single panel, a single wind turbine, a single biodiversity feature, or any water harvesting, even though they are on the floodplain. If we are really serious about tackling climate change, then we need to be much more robust about our response. And these could be manufactured locally to create employment. They could be serviced locally by people trained at the local college. And it wouldn't cost the taxpayer anything. You just legislate to say that every factory, every building should be treated in this way. And you would create revenue, you'd create jobs, and you would start to tackle the energy crisis. And it would be climate friendly. So why are we not doing it? At a regional level, we have responses led by the Yorkshire and Humber Climate Commission. They have net zero targets. They are looking to build resilience. They are looking at a just transition to new situations and new scenarios. And they're looking at nature recovery. This is all fine, although we now have a bundle of people in power politically who probably don't subscribe to these things. But we have 30 commissioners, and they have meetings and panels. There's research and development. They're looking at the future economy, moving to net zero. They're looking at policy drivers, etc. There are big issues of land, water, nature, and food, land use, economy, community, nature recovery. So we need to think about what are the expected and predicted scenarios. And these are predictions. These are not set in stone. So warmer temperatures, but maybe unevenly. Maybe drier summers, wetter winters, heavier rainfall during storms. And some of the summer storms, we're getting catastrophic heavy rainfall, which is causing flash flooding, increased extreme events. And the extreme events are more extreme and they occur more frequently. So increased flooding, species changes, new pests and diseases. And the outcomes are increased uncertainty and risks to people and nature. We will live in a much changed world. I would argue that we already do. So we need to think very seriously about mitigation and adaptation, tackling causes, reducing emissions, capturing carbon. So it's a multifaceted approach to deal with these issues and dealing with the effects. So part of it is trying to reduce climate change, but also is dealing with the effects which are certainly going to happen. We need to look at resilience. We need to look at accommodating changes, accepting transformations. So local responses and actions. We need to think global, but act local. And I would argue that a key part of the response has to be local community action. We have to empower communities to take action to deal with these things. There are major opportunities, for example, to rewild landscapes in lowland England. Many of these areas were drained through the 1600s, land improvement, as it was called. And we have projects to address climate change, sea level rise, and regional socioeconomics. We're doing this in places like Fish Lake and in the Ancon Valley near Scunthorpe and in other areas. And these need to be supported by local stakeholders to reverse negative socioeconomic trends and to help areas to become more resilient to the environmental changes. And some of this deals with things like heritage, understanding our background, understanding farming, understanding the communities, thinking about biodiversity, thinking about landscape, thinking about communities. And some of these can actually, like I say, with the solar panels, the solar generation can form regional growth poles for nature-based tourism and local economies. We can actually power a landscape better by rewilding it, but also having energy generation and all sorts of other initiatives going on. But we're going to be looking at new types of farming, new opportunities. And to do this, we need to grow the skills and the enthusiasm. We need to re-engage people with nature. We need to reconnect the pollinators and the flowers, because the pollinators deliver huge amounts of ecosystem services and incredibly valuable, irreplaceably valuable services for food production, etc. And engaging people with the hidden biodiversity, the fungi. When we see the fruit bodies at this time of year, that's just like the flower of the flowering plant. The fungi are what powers the rest. They power natural grasslands. The fungi power the trees, the great oak trees, the ash trees, the birch trees are actually powered by fungi in their roots, helping their nutrition, but also within their tissues, fighting off infections and disease. And the problem the trees have is that we've changed temperature, we've affected their nutrition through nitrogen fallout, and we have thrown into disarray their balance with the fungi. And that is causing huge problems. So those diseases I talked about spreading through trees and woodlands are actually driven by climate change and by the other environmental changes that we are foisting on them. And the solution is not just to cut the trees down. It's actually to stop doing what we're doing. So we need to think about these things. And the great thing with nature is it's a very powerful way to re-engage people, to get people involved, and to find ways that at a local level you can take some action. Because the danger with everything I've been saying is that people think, well, I'm powerless, I can't do anything. Well, that's not going to help. We need everybody to be engaged, everyone to be taking action. And you can do it from a local level for biodiversity, providing bat boxes and roosting sites, to having a wildlife garden, to working for your local community green space, working with a wildlife trust, working with education groups, etc. So we can all do our bit. And like with wildlife gardening, I think we've got something like, I can't remember the exact figures, it might be 15 million gardens, private gardens in the UK. That's a very powerful set of people to change the world. If they all start creating habitat for bats, for birds, and for pollinators, we can actually have a huge impact. This is at someone's garden just down the road from me in a very modest 1970s detached house with an open plan front garden. And about 10 years ago, the cattle got out from the nearby park. This is a very suburban area, by the way. Went up and down the lane and they trampled over his open plan front garden. And within a year, orchids popped up and he's been mowing around them ever since. And we have had thousands of them. Now imagine that occurring in every community green space, in everybody's lawn. You could change the world bit by bit. So what we're trying to do through some of our projects is work with farmers, landowners, and communities to encourage a richer future, better adapted to climate change and other challenges. Climate is changing, biodiversity is under pressure, and landscapes are threatened by sea level rise, sea level change, and inland flooding. So we need to think about assessing the situation, evaluating it, adapting, monitoring, reviewing, and then repeating the cycle. This is going to be an ongoing process for forever. We have to now learn to live with these changes. We have to anticipate them. We have to adapt. We have to aim to build resilience. We have to manage change. This has to be underpinned by effective ways of working. And there are some key challenges across the region. So by 2080, it's expected there'll be over 20% decrease in summer rainfall. But when it comes, it will come in bucket loads. So you're going to get flooding. 12% increase in winter rainfall. And important for food production and for pests and diseases and biodiversity, there will be seasonal changes as well as overall changes. So it's not just a switch, it's a change in the pattern as well. And nature finds that quite difficult to adapt to in the short term. There will be issues for health and lifestyle. There'll be challenges. We need to enable people to take responsibility, to engender community action. Really important, we need to encourage and support community champions. We need to grow people's skills and confidence so people can take action. And we need to share the messages and the experiences, both good and bad. And one of the good things now, the internet is a mixed blessing in many ways, but one of the great things it allows you to do is to network. And through networking and training, we can empower local people. And one of the ones that we want to do is showcase positive actions. Show people what you can do. On the one hand, we're talking about absolutely frightening scenarios. On the other hand, we need to show people what they can do and how they can take action at all these different levels. So thinking global, acting local. When inevitable changes come, and they will, we need to anticipate and adapt. Far better than waiting until we're forced to respond. I've been talking to farmers in the lowland areas about this and say, well, and most of them now, I think are understanding the message. Either you start to change things now and you adapt, you minimize the impact, but also you adapt to what will happen. Or in 50 to 60 years' time, your descendants who are farming this land will be forced to respond. Which do you want to do? We have projects working together to bring about improvements and through this celebrating the farming heritage, because one of the things with conservation groups is they cannot do this themselves. For a long, long time, conservation and farming have been seen to be diametrically opposite. They're the opposite ends of attention. And yet, the conservation organisations, the agencies, the groups, the trusts, etc., cannot solve this problem by themselves. They have to engage the wider landowners. And these things are starting to happen now. We're starting to get it. And that means having a respect. Farmers have caused a huge amount of damage to nature and the landscape, but they've done that because we, the public, the community, the politicians, have told them to produce intensive, cheap food. And they've done it very well. It's what we've told them to do. We're now working to work with farmers to produce stuff more sustainably, with less damage to the landscape, with less damage to biodiversity, less damage to people's health. So we're looking at re-wetting and rewilding in the lowlands wherever possible, but at the same time maintaining viable economic farming. Overall, we need to reconnect our wild side and work within the grain of nature, or with the grain of nature, because what we're looking for is a richer, more biodiverse countryside. I've talked to farmers who have farmed for their entire life, and they say, well, we've done really well, we've made lots of money, we've been successful, we've produced what the government wanted. I now look at my farm and I find it utterly depressing, and I want to know what I can do to make it better. So the message is getting out there. People love to connect with nature. People are excited about contact with nature. Do have a look at some of the information on our website. This is the UK EcoNet website up here. And in this particular case, /Ancombe, that's our Ancombe Valley project near Scunthorpe. And there's loads of videos and podcasts and workshops. There's even a virtual flyover of the valley, so you can see what happened from the 1600s to the present day and what might happen with sea level rise. So have a look at some of those, because although it's specific to the Ancombe, they are of great interest to a wider audience as well. But we're looking at biodiversity as a hook to bring about bigger changes. And it's everything that we do. It's our society. It's how we feed ourselves, how we educate ourselves, etc. And this came out today, and this is just to finish with. It's not exactly new. I write about drainage of fenlands, and this is what I call the East of England fens, the Cambridgeshire fens, the North Lincolnshire, South Yorkshire fens, and there's also up here Lake Pickering near Scarborough. So you go up all the way to near York and north. And that is the area that they're saying will be at risk of being underwater because of sea level rise in the next 30 years. Look at London. Now, in actual fact, what those are the areas largely which were drained in the 16 and 1700s, and they are going to get wet again. Now, if that isn't enough to make people think very, very deeply and urgently, then I don't know what will, because that has a massive impact on a lot of people. It also has a huge impact on our ability to feed ourselves, because these areas are breadbasket landscapes at the present time. And it may be that in 50, 60 years, other countries from whom we presently import food may not be capable or willing to export their food to us. So where are we going to generate food for future generations? So that came out today. As I say, to me, it's not really new science, but it does reinforce a point. And I think following hard on the heels of what's happened this last summer, then it is something that should make people think, look up and take notice. Thank you very much for listening. There's lots more on my website, my research website. There's more edgy stuff on my blog, which also has lots of fun things about nature. And there's stuff on my Twitter. If any of you are into Twitter, then it's on there as well. So thank you for listening, and it's been a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you so much, Ian, for that rich and worrying and inspiring talk. There's not enough of us for me to worry about hands putting up, so you don't feel that you need to put your hands up. Just go for it, but be mindful of other people who might wish to ask Ian questions. So we've got time for Q&A now. Thank you. Thank you so much, Ian.
Thank you.
Well, I'm kind of pushy and direct, Helen. So thank you for an excellent talk covering all the main points in a really understandable way, and also instilling some hope. I've got one point and one question for you. The I have also heard other sort of nature conservancy and sort of the wild, I can't remember what its name is, but there's a local one that covers the sort of western side of Sheffield and the western moors and wetlands that are there on the moorland that's there. And one of their strategies is that politicians are so focused on the current economic model, which is basically money generating, doing things cheaply and then making as much money for it as possible. But things that you look at, like a beautiful woodland with bluebells in the summer or meadowland, has no value at all in that system. And so actually they're trying to assign an economic value to all of those different wild places that we need in order to survive, so that those people who are just not on the same page can actually understand what's going on better and what we're losing and destroying better. And my question was that you've talked very clearly and concisely about all of the individual risks, but not touched on those positive feedback loops that can and actually are occurring, which could potentially lead to a sudden catastrophic increase in change. And so how worried should we be about methane release from melting permafrost that's happening because of raised temperatures in areas, and things like massive quick loss of albedo, like collapse of ice shelves, which then doesn't radiate solar energy? How worried should we be about those sort of positive feedback loops?
Very, very. I think is the answer to that. Yeah. I mean, it could be a much longer presentation than I've done. One of the things I do research on all sorts of different things. I do research on woodlands and woodland history, but I also have done a lot of work on fenlands and peatlands. And one of the things that has not been recognised, and I've worked with a number of the leading people in the UK on this, but we didn't get the research funding to do the necessary scientific work in the computer model, is that we've realised that wetlands were far more extensive than people have realised. Up to about 15, 16, 1700s, there were far more extensive wetlands. And we've argued that the drainage of those, which has been an inherent part of the capitalist-driven economic revolution, has been a key aspect of climate change, because on the one hand, it released massive amounts of carbon, and none of this has been put into any of the figures, any of the equations, because they just didn't realize that these areas were wetlands. And I showed historically, I've found lots and lots of evidence showing these peat bogs and these wetlands over huge areas. And if you start to put that into the equation, then that takes back the release of carbon to pre-industrial, and you start to see a massive effect. So you're on the one hand reducing your ability to mop carbon up and to respond. You're also lowering the soil, so the land is shrinking, which is part of the flooding issue I've just shown at the end, and you're triggering the release of massive amounts of carbon that's triggering climate change. And then all that then starts to have an impact on sea level rise, which is catastrophic. And a big reason for sea level rise is not the actual amount of water in the ice sheets, it's the changing temperature of the sea. And as the sea warms, it expands, the water expands, and it just rises. And if that happens, they were talking at one point about, it'll be 0.5 meter by 2080. And then they would say, it might be about 1 meter. Now it's 1.5 meters. Well, and that's the mean sea level. That's not a tidal surge, which is what we had when we had the Sheffield flood in 2007. In the autumn, there was a tidal surge down the North Sea that very nearly overtopped the Thames barrier and various other flood barriers. And that's where everything, the tides, the winds, everything forces the North Sea down, and it funnels into the channel, and it can't get out. And it rises catastrophically along the East Coast, which we saw in the 1950s. And everything we're doing is just making it worse. It's compounding the whole effect. But it's almost impossible for politicians to stand back and look at these issues and look at the long term. Whatever they're doing is short term, Because, and I've got friends who are politicians, and it's not everybody, but a lot of politicians, their main reason for taking action is to make sure they get back in next time. So, you know, there are big problems. When I said about the solar panels, and I find solar panels on farmland difficult visually because of landscape impacts. And also if they lose productive farmland, that is possibly a problem. But why are we not generating? You know, we hear from government, we want to be carbon neutral, we want sustainable economies, we want a green economy, we want to enhance biodiversity, we want to have nature recovery. Then why are we not just saying to industry, when you build a factory, you've got to have a solar powered roof. You've got to be generating. And with the energy prices now, with the energy crisis, it would make economic sense for anyone with a business to do that anyway. But why are we not just saying, do it? You know, you must have every building that's under a certain age could be retrofitted. And it would be economically viable, economically positive. It would give young people jobs. It would give people hope. It would be something positive that we can do. And I just don't understand why we don't break out of the cycle. We're allowing these negative positive feedbacks, if you see what I mean, to happen. But when we could do something that could actually deal with it, yeah, we are okay, we're going to go carbon neutral. Local authorities have been told they must be carbon neutral by 2050. Then do it. Don't talk about it, do it. 2050 is not that far away. Sorry, I'm ranting.
I think we could all rant. Oh, sorry.
Don't worry, Helen. Thanks, Ian. That was really interesting. I guess to go back to your title, I guess I feel like I am despairing a bit and I am taking action. You know, I do dozens of personal choice things about how I travel and what I eat and what I buy. And it's right to do all of that. And also it's so woefully insufficient. And one of the big themes that we work with as part of our group is about appropriate response, like what is the appropriate thing to do in any given circumstance. And I guess I'm so despairing that I tend not to turn towards what's happening with the environment. I tend to turn away from it most of the time. And if I actually sit and really engage with it, like through this talk, it feels like actually the appropriate thing to do is probably go out and join an Extinction Rebellion and glue myself to a road. Like it's so bad. But then, you know, I don't want to lose my job and I XYZ. And so I don't do those things. And that dissonance is hard to live with. And I guess it feels like part of the problem is that we're still trying to fix this existential threat from within the paradigm that caused it. Yeah. And so, you know, and every new thing I learn is more depressing. This week, someone was telling me about the environmental problems of producing wind turbines and batteries for solar panels and the mining of graphite and lithium and cobalt. And that feeds into the war in Ukraine because so many of those minerals are in Donbass, and not unlikely that that's why there's a war there right now. And so I guess we're not even the biggest things we're doing to try to address the problem are not right societally, because we won't face up to the fact that actually we have to do is change our lifestyle and have a lower standard of living and not have an economy that grows 2.5% every year. But I don't know how we do that. I know how to get the train instead of a plane. I know how to vote for a different party, even if you don't go to government. I don't know how you get a paradigm shift for society. And I'm not going to ask you how we do that because I don't think anyone really knows. But I guess what I might do is ask you, as someone who is able to turn towards all of this because you are able to do this for your job, how do we do it? How do we live with it and keep showing up and keep engaging when it's this fucking depressing?
I think my short answer to that, if there is one, is that we have no choice. We have to actually face it. We have to be positive. And we owe it to future generations to be that. And I've always had this feeling that as individuals, we can all do something. And if we all do something, then it starts to amount to an awful lot. A little bit up, like I said, with gardens. People ask me, well, why do you talk about wildlife gardening? Why do you talk about rewilding your garden? Well, it's because there's actually millions of us, and if we all do it, we can have an impact. And that's good for us. It's not just for nature, it's good for people. And we found this with COVID lockdown. People suffered nature deprivation, and contact with nature is incredibly healing. Now, I organised an online conference about rewilding the mind, rewilding the body at about that time. And some of the stuff was just, there was a doctor who was the government advisor on nature therapy. And what he said was utterly convincing, and saves the community millions, if not billions of pounds for the NHS. Because if we do what we were talking about in the meeting, people are healthier, happier, fitter, and they place less burden then on the health services. But we just don't do it. Because the economic model we've got, the money is allocated, huge amount of money is allocated to the health service, but it's all allocated for treating people that are already sick. Very little of it is allocated towards stopping people being ill in the first place. And then you just feel like you're beating your head on a brick wall. You know, you feel, why are we not doing this? Like the thing with the solar panels on the motorways, why are we not just doing it? It's so obvious we should do it. In terms of things, I've, like I said at the outset, I think you have to try and have a positive message. You have to try and stay positive. As an environmentalist, I have to say sometimes I find the whole thing profoundly depressing. Because I left my university last year because it was very hard to do the things I want to do with the constraints that were increasingly being placed on me at my university. So I'm now emeritus professor, and I've got more time to do the things I really care about. But it is very, very difficult because you have to try to have a positive message. You have to try and support people. And I'm contacted by groups all over the country concerned about overdevelopment in their areas, because we have governments that see environmentalism as red tape, and they want to free it all up to a market-driven, build type economy, which is clearly not sustainable. At the same time, they say that we're going to be sustainable, we're going to be a green economy, we're going to be carbon neutral, but then they're not doing it. So I get contacted by groups, and a lot of the time I know that really I can give them a little bit of comfort and some advice, and I've appeared at public inquiries on their behalf and things like that. But in many cases, they're going to lose. And that is really very, very sad and very depressing. On the other hand, in some cases, I'm working with communities and I think we may well win. And even if they lose, we might get a better deal than they would otherwise have got. And if we don't do it, who's going to stick up for nature? And one of the things that we can all do, for example, is through education and for future generations. And we need to be just trying to get the message to people. In Sheffield, we had the student strikes. The school students went and took a day out and protested. And there were people writing into the Star. And I write for the Star and the Telegraph in Sheffield. But people writing in saying, oh, it's terrible. These children should be in school being educated. This is, well, yeah, but they've got a longer interest in this than we have, to be frank. Yeah, they are concerned, they're upset, and they're showing their concern. That is part of education, surely. That is, to me, that was really positive. But you get people saying, oh, it's terrible. They should be being educated in school. No, they should be expressing their concerns, their feelings.
Yeah, they have been educated in school. That's why they're doing it.
Yeah, hopefully.
That what you said, Claire, resonates with me, because things that seem very simple, so like, well, go vegetarian or go vegan, actually, when you start thinking about it, is very complicated, because because of the way the economy is, if you go into a shop and you buy vegetables, but first of all, you have to know, what are your seasonal vegetables, where they come from, what are the road miles, you're contributing to the problem. So I guess my compromise for that is that I do have an allotment, and I'm also a member of a community farm. And actually what that requires is a hell of a lot of labor,
Yeah.
which is very hard work, but it keeps me fit and it keeps me out of the house, so I don't have to pay my heating bills because I'm always out of the house. And yeah, get a horse. Although that's not fun either.
I mean, what you do find is there are some really encouraging community-based projects and really inspiring projects. So there's the doom and gloom on the one hand and huge problems, but there are always individuals who are champions. There are projects that are wonderful where people are taking action, where they are doing things. And you can see young people getting involved and engaged. And, you know, we have projects where we're working over in Fish Lake. We're doing a project at Worlow. We're doing a project with lottery support in the Ancombe Valley. And one of the things we try to do is just say to people, these are the messages, this is the information we can give you. On the one hand, this is why we've got to do it. On the other hand, these are things that you can do, positive things you can do. And just talk to people, talk to your neighbours, talk to the school kids, talk to the teachers, talk to the community leaders, go and talk to your church group, you know, talk to people at the bus stop. Because that's the way you change the world. I mean, I genuinely believe that as individuals, we can change the world.
Thank you, Ian. Two things stick in my, well, lots of things stick in my mind, but I'm going to pick two for now: community and legislation. And I think you're right about finding a like-minded group of people who share your vision and your hopes and your motivations. The sticking point is people who have the power, who are motivated only by money. And every time I hear a talk and I think about this more and more, leads me to the place where XR is, in that we have no choice. There is no choice, which is something you said earlier. We have no choice but to act. And the thing about XR is they are making a noise. Politicians can't ignore them. No. They cause disturbance, but unless there's disturbance, nobody's going to take any notice anyway. So it just leads me to thinking, yes, we all, well, I need to join and be more active in XR. So,
well, I mean, with the present political changes, which we'll not go into, I'm sure we're all of a similar mind on this, but the RSPB, that has always been a very conservative organisation with a small c, has been advocating its members to take direct action for nature. I mean, that starts to tell you that we are in a pretty bad place at the moment, when organisations like that really would have been a long way from that type of thing in the past, are actually starting to take notice and starting to do something. And, you know, well done, basically.
Kath, did you want to talk?
Well, I just wanted to say you don't have to glue yourself anywhere to be part of XR. You don't have to do anything if you don't want, actually. And the last weekend we were in London, actually, and just sat outside Downing Street. We didn't get much publicity, but we just sat for 6 hours. There were no arrests. It was completely a case of just joining together and actually sharing our thoughts about what's going on. But one of the things we did one evening was paint the streets. And I will send you, Helen, some of the fantastic posters and things that it took about education. And that's what struck me was so important about what we did, because everywhere, we went all over London, and we put at the bus stops and in the tubes, we put posters, and they were very varied as to help people think about it, you know. And actually, I think that's got to be useful for people to get talking about what is that poster about? What does it mean? You know, things about like that feeling of powerless being named and what we can do. So, I mean, there are lots of things you can do within exile which are completely safe, in that you can just be part of the backup, the media or whatever. But it is about now, what we're trying to do is talk to people. It is totally about talking to people and going, just asking people how they're finding things with the climate, what do they think about it, and, you know, just getting conversations going so that there is more hope and more willingness to put pressure on our government and our corporations. Because what they reckon, if you're interested, I'll say a bit more, is if we get 3.5% of the population engaged in acting, that is a tipping point from past experience, past studies, that shows that there is then movement from the corporations and from the governments. So yeah, that's where XR is at the minute.
I mean, one of the things I've been very interested in, so I do a lot of work on historic changes, and I started to do a lot of work on fenlands and fenland drainage. And one of the myths is that the fens were drained to produce food, which they weren't. It was an aggressive act by vested interest to take the commons from the commoner. And that's a different socio-economic and political argument. And it's something I got very, very interested in. I've worked with some very eminent historians on this. But you see the commons being taken from the commoner, and it was largely in fact, one of the consequences of this was the English Civil War, because the fens were going to be drained and the fenmen rose up, and it triggered the Civil War. Oliver Cromwell came to power on the back of the Fenland Revolt, and then when he was in power, he drained the fens anyway. So, typical politician, I'm afraid. But the whole issue about the land and the resources and nature and who they belong to, which starts to become quite an interesting philosophical debate, and that a lot of our problems really stem from the separation of people from the natural resources and the lack of respect for nature. I mean, I would even argue that a lot of the arguments about sustainable development that developed in the 1980s, 1990s are very human orientated and have very little to do with actually having respect for nature itself. It's all to do with sustaining nature for people to be sustained in the future, not for nature. There's no respect for nature itself. So I have quite strong views about that. And a lot of the environmental changes and challenges that we've had historically have come about through direct action to challenge some of those assumptions. The first ones that you could probably argue would be the levelers, and then people like the Open Spaces and Commons Society tearing down the enclosures in the 1800s, the 1800s, and fighting against enclosure and the theft of the commons. Because the commons are taken away, the commoner becomes either a poacher, or they migrate to the cities to become wage slaves. And you can see the rest of the thing unfolds from that. One of the earliest direct action organizations was Earth First in North America, and they were campaigning to stop the appalling, and it's still going on in some places, appalling felling of the giant redwoods. You've got trees, 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 years old, and we cut them down as some sort of economic resource that we have the right to take. We don't have the right to take, they have a right to be there. And the clever thing with Earth First was that they said they'd put nails into the timber, which means you can't chainsaw them and you can't take them to a sawmill. You don't actually have to do it. You just have to say you've done it. But if you put a big trunk like that through a sawmill and it's got a 6-inch iron nail in it, then you have a disaster. But you don't actually have to say that. You don't actually have to do it. You just have to threaten to have done it. One of the local direct action organizations there's a very sad twist to this, which I'll not go into, but was the campaign to save Thorn and Hatfield Moors in the 1970s, 1980s, where Fisons were draining this once vast fenland and peat bog for peat for gardens. And students and staff from all over the North of England universities went in at night and blocked up the drains, and Fisons went in during the day and blew them up with dynamite. And it went on until eventually Fisons said that they would sit around the table and negotiate. So sometimes we have had to take very significant direct action. Otherwise, what is now a huge national nature reserve would not be there. And one of the things I have a problem with when I taught students is trying to get them to understand. I wrote a book on environmental history, and then I realized that things that I had been party to and I was writing about, not only were these students not born then, but their parents were very young at that stage. At that point, I started to feel really old. But the students have got no idea that we had to fight to get national parks. Sheffield was where that started, Sheffield and Manchester. They think we've always had national parks, and we've always had a green belt, and we've always had wildlife trusts, we've always had nature reserves. And you have to say, look, we've only got all these things because we fought for them. And when you have a government that's threatening to take them away from you, you take it seriously.
Thank you, Ian.
I hope that's not left anyone terribly depressed. You really have to be positive. You have to feel that you can do something. We've, individuals, as I say, individuals change the world. Peter Scott set up the World Wide Fund for Nature. He set up the Wildfire and Wetlands Trust. He started off as wildfire. He did it by himself. I'm talking to farmers who are coming to me saying, I just want to do something. I want to make things better. We're talking to big landowners. Before lockdown has changed it. What I've done for many, many years is organise conferences and seminars. And with lockdown and everything else, that's really hit the buffers a bit. But our last rewilding conference, about a year or so before lockdown, we had something, this is to a conservation conference. We had 10 of the big landed estates turn up. And quite often we had things like, the head forester for Chatsworth or someone like that would turn up. We got the forester, the land agent, and the owner turning up to discuss what could be done. And these are people who just want to do something. They want to do things differently. They want to be able to make money out of it, obviously, but they want to do things differently, and they want to help heal some of the wounds. And I thought that was, terribly positive and significant.
Absolutely, and thank you for sharing so much with us this evening, Ian.
You're very welcome.
I mean, I'm left with lots of different emotions. It's not one thing or the other. It's not depression or hope or jubilation or misery. It is a whole collection of everything that consists of who we are and how the world is. And you've given us a really wonderful, rich, thought-provoking talk, which I myself have thoroughly enjoyed and got a lot from, and will be thinking about for the next however long to come. And I'm very, very thankful for you on behalf of Just This Sangha for talking with us this evening.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm aware that we've run out of time, and thank you everybody for your questions.
Yeah, it's been really interesting discussion.
Thank you. Thank you.
Do follow my blog and do follow my
We will.
Twitter if you're on Twitter as well.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
If anybody's got any last remarks, wants to share anything, yeah, go for it and mute yourselves. And
Thank
you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you all.
thank
Take
you
care.
so much, Ian.
I
Take
just
care.
wanted
I
to
hope-
say that from a Buddhist perspective, we just act because it's the right thing to do.
Yeah.
And that's the end of it. The consequences, we can't know,
Yeah.
but we must act. Now, I found that very, very helpful and thought-provoking. And I want to thank you very much, Ian.
Thank you. Much appreciated.
Thank you, Ian. I hope we'll see you again.
I'm sure we
Maybe
will.
we'll